Hey, seniors, let's take a look at your readings for your final exam. Um, let's just go through those together, shall we? So, the first, we have two nonfiction articles to start with. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be doing some compare and contrasting between the two of them. So, the first nonfiction passage is an excerpt from an article called The New Survivors by Pamela Weintraub of 2019. In her article, The New Survivors, Pamela Weintraub examines the attitudes and mindsets of cancer survivors. As you read, take notes on the author's central idea and how cancer patients have been impacted by their experiences. So, this section is called Learning to Hope. Carol Ferran, an elder care expert from Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, sought to understand why some nursing home residents thrive despite adversity and isolation, while others just withered away. The difference between the two groups, she found, was hope. Not the blind or rigid optimism that usually passes for hope, but an open sense of possibility, acceptance of risk, and a willingness to work things out. Hopeful people face reality in clear eyed fashion, doing the best they can. One woman, too sick to go outdoors, for instance, maintained an upbeat attitude by remembering the emotional riches of her past. The hopeful person looked at reality and then arrived at solutions. If a hoped for outcome became impossible, the hopeful person would find something else to hope for, Ferran found. The role of hope in cancer has also come under scrutiny. Psychologists at the Royal Marsden Hospital in London and Sutton studied women with early stage breast cancer and found the risk of recurrence or death increased significantly among those who lacked hope. There was nothing mysterious or mystical about it. Hopeful patients managed their illness themselves instead of letting outsiders pull the strings. They often chose the most aggressive treatments, and envisioning the light at the end of the tunnel helped provide the strength they needed to get through each difficult day. Yet hope was not a given for them. It was an attitude they wrested from despair. Despite being an expert on hope, Ferran could not muster any when herself was diagnosed with breast cancer. She met the news with anger, grief, and fear of death. Panic propelled her through treatment in a total daze. Only when she went in for breast reconstruction was a wise nurse able to penetrate her panic. A year from now, you'll be where you want to be, but there's no way to get there except by going through this experience now. As despair loosened its hold on Ferran, she tried to embrace the flexibility she had studied in others. I told myself to get a grip, she said. Finally, she thought of her love of playing piano and decided to buy a metronome, a symbol of what she called slow time. It was a palpable reminder to calm down, confront her fear of death, and think things through. You can start in despair, but arrive at hope, says Ferran. 18 years later, hope can be learned. So that was the first article, and it really focused on the role of hope and how it was used by cancer patients to manage and treat their illnesses. The second passage is an excerpt from Can a Devastating Shark Attack Really Lead to a Better Life by Melanie Greenberg of 2011. In this 2011 article, psychologist Melanie Greenberg, PhD, discusses Bethany Hamilton's experience of losing her arm while surfing. According to Dr. Greenberg, the way Bethany dealt with this traumatic event is an example of what psychologists call post traumatic growth. As you read, makes notes about the ways Bethany grew as a person and the psychology behind it. And this passage is called A New Appreciation of Life. People also report a greater appreciation of the life they have following trauma. Bethany lost a huge amount of blood and came very close to dying. When people look death in the eye, they may realize how good it is just to be alive. Bethany's trip to Thailand was a turning point because she met people in situations worse off than hers. She felt tremendous compassion for a woman who had lost her family, leading Bethany to appreciate the close bond she had with her own family. When she learned to surf again with one arm, she experienced the joy of being able to do this. This part of the movie brought to mind psychologist Shelley Taylor's concept of downward comparison. We can restore our self esteem by comparing ourselves to people who are even worse off, or to hypothetical worse outcomes, such as dying or being unable to surf again. Relative to these imagined fates, our current situation seems fortunate. In addition to the post traumatic growth aspect, Soul Surfer also sent a powerful message that being beautiful and strong on the inside was more important than what you look like on the outside. Bethany expressed her concern that boys would not be attracted to her with one arm. Yet at the end, she seemed to come to terms with the loss. She even rejected the idea of wearing a non functional prosthetic arm just for appearances. While not everybody who experiences trauma has the resources, abilities, and family support that Bethany had, this movie is a beautiful illustration of the human capacity to thrive, even in the face of devastating events. If you have experienced a traumatic event or a difficult childhood, it may help to think about the personal strength that you showed to survive these events. Even if you made some mistakes or did some things you regret, you did what you had to do to survive, and that is something to be proud of. Think about the things you have in your life currently that make it meaningful, be it relationships, your work, your faith, or taking care of your family. Try to find everyday happiness in the life you have now. Think about what you have learned from going through difficulties and about how you might use this knowledge to help yourself and other people or create something of value for the world. And know that growth and hope can coexist with grief and that there will be ups and downs when one or other emotion dominates. All right, so those are the two nonfiction passages. And let's go ahead and let's take a look at an annotated copy here that I've also included this with you. And again, I'm using the same color coding that we've been using, yellow for things that we don't get, blue for important aspects or things that we really need to know, and then purple or that magenta color, meaning that these are things that we need to know about theme, central idea, some of those really important elements of the story. So let's take a look at this. So first off, Pamela Weintraub examines the attitudes and mindsets of cancer survivors. And that's really kind of what this article is about, looking at how people go into illnesses and how their attitude and the way they're looking at things helps them out. And then again, I noted here Carol Ferran, who is central to the story or central to this article. So it gives us a little bit of background about her, right? And then this here, why some nursing home residents thrive despite adversity and isolation while others just withered away. This was the goal of her research. This is what she was trying to discover. Why in the same setting, two different people with very similar issues had different outcomes. What was the difference between them? Looking at these two, they should have had the same outcome. What was the difference? Interesting here. This was a bolded word: blind or rigid optimism. And so when we think about blind, that's unseeing, right, or not seeing. So you choose not to look. And rigid is unbending. Optimism is like just this overly positive attitude, right? Like, oh, no matter what, it's all going to turn out good. And so notice this in the bold here is that's a very significant line there apparently. One woman too sick to go outdoors, for instance, maintained an upbeat attitude by remembering the emotional riches of her past. This I highlighted in the magenta because, again, it seems to be this is like a really key example, right? So we talked about like they were using, mental attitudes and how people were, or, what kind of position they were in mentally. This is an example. So it's like, this is like, we said, like, this is what we're looking at. Here's a specific example of it. If you go down a little bit, psychologists at the Royal Marsden Hospital studied women with early stage breast cancer, and they found that the risk of recurrence or death increased among those who lacked hope. So they were looking at this, and I highlighted this in blue because this is really key here. This was the key finding of their research, right? That here's two women, or different groups of women. These women who had hope, they seemed to do better. They had more positive outcomes. These people over here that didn't have hope, they seemed to have worse outcomes or different outcomes, right? Meant that their breast cancer came back after remission, right? Or they had a relapse, or that they ended up maybe not making it. And so that the key difference between them appeared to be hope. Why did that happen? Okay. And so here's some things to think about. Why did this group with hope have a better outcome? And then their research found out that they managed their illnesses themselves. So they were really focused on helping themselves through it. And then they also had this goal, right? They had this place. They had a light at the end of the tunnel. And because they had that place to go to or to look for or to be shooting for, they just did what they needed to do to get to that place. So again, the people without hope, they didn't have an end, right? They just felt like the worst was going to happen. They were only looking for the worst. They never really could see where they were going to go. And so things were just always bad for them. The people with hope, they had a goal, they had a target. Interestingly enough, though, we have Fran here. She ended up getting breast cancer, right? Um, and again, we don't want to say this irony or anything like that, but I think it's rather significant because here's a person who was studying the role of hope in women who have breast cancer, and she ends up being diagnosed with breast cancer. This goes on to talk about a lot of like how um, she did not do well with her diagnosis. She did not have that hope. She didn't show that positive attitude. But it notes here that when she went in for breast reconstruction, that there was a wise nurse who told her, "You can start in despair, but arrive at hope." So what she thinks about, when she really thinks about this, I'm sorry. This is what the nurse said here. A year from now, you'll be where you want to be, but there's no way to get there except through going through this experience. This is what the nurse said, right? And this is really what turned Farron around. And Farron, then she took that, and that's where she came up with this lesson. You can start in despair, but you can arrive in hope, right? So she said that you can move from this, which she did. And by the way, she said that 18 years later. And then just the key takeaway from all of this then would be that hope can be something that's learned. If we're looking at the second passage, I think we need to start with a little bit of context. And maybe you're familiar with this story, maybe you're not, I'm not sure. Bethany Hamilton was a competitive surfer. She was a world-class surfer. She was up and coming. She was rather famous. She was getting sponsorships or looking for sponsorships, and she really was doing extremely well. And then she lost her arm in a shark attack. She almost died. Probably, by all accounts, she should have died, right? But she survived. She survived the experience. She went on to learn how to surf one-armed, or with one arm, one-handed. She learned to surf. She re-taught herself the whole thing, and then got right back into competitive form. But it was a process, and she really went through a lot. There was a rather low time, and then she came back. And her story really looks at the fact that that learning how to surf again really was kind of that turning point for her. That really gave her that advance, that ability to get past that. Right. The movie version of this is called Soul Surfer. You may have seen this. There's it it's a Christian movie, but it did make, it was rather popular for a while there. Um, in the movie, in the story, and you see it in the movie as well. She goes to Thailand on a mission trip, and the mission trip there, she sees a lot of people who really have things a lot worse off than her. And this is kind of the place where she opened her eyes, right? Like, okay, look at these people, and they're still thriving, right? They're still doing things. Why am I not doing this, right? And it brought across this idea. So psychologist Shelley Taylor's concept of downward comparison. In other words, we can get ourselves back into the right place by comparing to ourselves to who are even worse off. So instead of thinking like, this is the worst, we have it the worst, there's nothing worse that could happen to me, we start to realize, yeah, there are some things that could be worse, either real or hypothetical, in imagined kind of things, right? And then once you see that and you put yourself in context, that you're like, hey, wait a minute, things aren't as bad. And that's the place where you can really start to build your self-esteem and really start to build yourself back up. This article really deals with this term called post-traumatic growth. And this is how a person grows after a traumatic event. What happens to them after, right? So if you think about kind of like an arc, if you will, right? So here's this person going along, and then some traumatic thing happens and you crash, right? Post-traumatic growth means that after this event, you start to build yourself back up. Now, where on that continuum do you get back to where you were? Do you go above or whatever, right? Or do you always stay below? And so this idea of where do you fall on that line? The article ends with some tips about what you could do to help yourself. If you have been in a traumatic event or if you've had a difficult experience, what can you do to kind of help yourself get past that? Again, I think it's important to notice both these are nonfiction, but both of them have to do with this mindset and how a positive mindset within you can help get you past that whatever issue that you have, right? And get back to where you were. Okay, so those are the two nonfiction pieces. Let's take a look at the fictional work here. And this was an article or a story called A Yankee Copetta from 2017. Okay. And again, this is fiction. Marcus stood by the window watching the dusk descend. He switched on the desk lamp. Turning back to draw the curtains, his hand caught a photo frame, which fell to the floor. He picked it up and ran his finger slowly and lovingly across the picture of a woman smiling. Sorry, my dear. 20 years later, and I still managed to knock you down. The door opened. Is that you, Jolene? He called. Nope. Wrong age, wrong gender, and wrong profession. It's your aging money minder, not your youthful girlfriend. Marcus grinned. Never mind. Come in, Albert. What brings you here? Don't tell me that I'm finally bankrupt. Help yourself to a drink. Not quite. Not yet. Yes, please. Shall I pour you one too? Marcus shook his head. My goodness, Marcus, are you sick? We've been drinking together since our teens. This is no time to stop. Albert glanced at the photo that Marcus was holding. Ah, I see. Old memories of a very rich widower. Marcus crossed the room to the fireplace. The nights are drawing in. I will need to light the fire later. He placed the photo on the shelf above the hearth, then turned back to Albert. I was never worthy of her. The other laughed. What sentimental nonsense. You gave her everything. The trips around the world, the private jet, the villa in the south of France, this mansion. I wasn't always there for her. You were creating and building the business to what it is now. Money doesn't grow on trees. No, and it doesn't build a relationship. No, but it certainly helps. I'm sure Jolene would agree with that. Marcus looked up sharply. What do you mean by that? Albert took a deep breath. Look, Marcus, the truth is, I didn't pass by here just to have a drink with my oldest friend. It is a more serious matter that brings me. I'm not sure how to say this. Go on, instructed Marcus. I don't mean to be sneak, but, well, we both know what the real world is like. Albert paused long enough to finish his drink. It's about Jolene. I saw her today on Madison Avenue. Of course you did. She went shopping, Marcus smiled. She loves shopping on Madison Avenue. Albert, feeling his courage stirred by the alcohol, said defiantly, She wasn't in a shop, Marcus. She was having lunch. She was with a young man. They were very lively together, very familiar. Well, overly familiar, almost intimate. Marcus seemed unperturbed, said nothing. You know, I know her background. It's always worried me that you picked her up from nowhere. All those years after your wife's death, you never looked at another woman. Then, a year ago, you met this girl from the Bronx who sells flowers at a corner store, and suddenly all has changed for you and for her. Maybe having reached this dizzying height, she wants to prepare for the future with someone younger? Marcus regarded him solemnly. Then he looked askance. You know nothing about this guy she was with. Oh, but I do. Albert seemed embarrassed. When he left her, I followed him to his office. His name is Peter Nasuno. He's a high-level executive at McKinsey Bank. That's all I found out. There was a silence. I'm sorry. I thought you should know. We've been best friends since we were kids. Marcus nodded. Yes, I see. It's good to know you are still looking out for me. He paused. I will deal with it from here. I think I will have that drink now. After Albert had left, Marcus lit the fire in the hearth and sat in his armchair regarding the flames. He heard the car crunch on the gravel outside, followed by the slamming of car doors and then the front door. A cheerful voice rang out. Marcus, darling, I'm home. In the library. Jolene brought energy and several carrier bags into the room. Her face was flushed and her smile was broad. Did you miss me? I hope so. What a day. I need a drink. No, don't get up. I'll do it. Do you want another? He shook his head. Come and show me what you brought today. She carried her drink and the day's treasures across the room and sat herself down on the rug in front of him. Oh, a lovely warm fire. My fingers are frozen. She stretched her hands out and watched the jewels on her fingers flicker in the firelight. Marcus leaned forward and, taking her hand, gently guided her up and onto his lap. With a soft voice, he said, They are beautiful, indeed. Now, Jolene, Tell me about Peter. She lowered her eyes. Her smile vanished. She contemplated her rings for a minute, and then, in a low, stern voice, Peter's fine. He sends his love, and as always, he thanks you for all the support you've given him over the years. Then, turning her head to face Marcus, she lifted her pitch and said, "But darling, you have to understand, he is not complete. He so much wants to meet you. After all these years of waiting patiently, he feels the time has come. He needs to know his father. It is so important for him, as it is for you. Isn't it time you acknowledged him as your son? You can't keep him as a secret forever, you know." She looked up at the photo on the shelf. Surely by now she could forgive you. He nodded and squeezed her hand gently. Yes, you are right. The relationship is all that matters. All right, so that is the fictional story, and let's take a look at some of this here because I think that if you stopped in a number of different places, like this story changes, right? Like if you just stop, like, oh, I know this. Oh, wait, oh no, I know. Oh, now I know. Now I know. And so it has these kind of these little twists and these little things, right? So let's take a look at what we've got here. First off, we think about visuals, we think about imagery. So when Marcus picks up the picture and he's just kind of running his hand over it gingerly, his fingers over gingerly, we really get a sense that he loves the woman in this picture, right? And we also get the sense that maybe she's no longer with us. Then he says 20 years later. So now we know it's been a long time, right? Okay. So in comes Albert. Albert is his money minder or his accountant, right? Um, Interestingly, though, that he makes this comment here that we've been drinking together since our teens. So now Marcus is a very successful businessman. We find out, we find out here in a bit that Marcus is a very successful businessman, and that Albert, who's his accountant, has been with him for a very long time. Again, I think that's going to become important here in a little bit. They make a joke like, "Oh, am I broke?" He goes, "Oh, no, not yet." And this is a kind of an interesting comment because we get to see this sense of Albert, right? Albert constantly, or is in several places, makes comments about like, are we sure that the money's okay? Are we sure the money's okay? Right? He makes those comments a few times. Now, again, as an accountant, that was his job, but then we kind of want to kind of think about, well, why is he really saying this, right? What is he really trying to get at? So if we get down here, you could just tell that Marcus, he says, "I was never worthy of her." And you really get this sense of longing, right? Like he's really looking back and just saying, "God, I miss her. She wasn't, I didn't deserve her. I didn't do right." I think he's just kind of sad about everything. Albert laughs that off. He's like, "Hey, wait a minute. Oh, no, 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 no. Look, you gave her everything, trips and money and palace and everything, right? You gave her everything." Marcus responds for it. He goes, "I wasn't always there." Albert's like, "No, no, you were creating the business. You sacrificed that for this, and that made her happy, and that gave her everything that she needed, right?" And then he says, "Money doesn't grow on trees," so that's his focus. Money is his focus, right? But then Marcus goes, but it doesn't build relationships either. Remember that word relationship, right? Because we see that again at the very end of this. I think that really now we get a sense of Marcus, who has all of this money, and we don't know how much, but we think it's a lot, right? He has all this money, and he realizes that money isn't everything. Albert, who's an accountant, who probably is pretty successful and has been with Marcus since they were kids, apparently, right? We don't know if he is or isn't rich. We know as an accountant he's probably successful, right? And we assume that Marcus is pretty generous. We get that sense of him throughout, right? But notice Albert is only focused on the money. It's the money, it's the money, it's the money, right? So notice the difference in attitudes between these two people, right? And then Albert says this, "No, but it helps." And I'm sure Jolene would agree with that. Marcus is instantly like, "What? Why do you say that? What do you mean by that?" And then we get a sense of, okay, Albert, what's going on? What's going on? Albert does not approve of Jolene, okay, does not apparently approve of Jolene. And we get a sense that something's about to happen here. Oh, it's more serious than that. I'm just not sure how to tell you this. I do want to note here this where it says that, Jolene was out shopping on Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue is kind of synonym for like rich or ritzy kind of shopping, right? It's kind of like when you say like, oh, I was on Madison Avenue, right? We also get a sense of Madison Avenue as being the place where like advertising and things happen, and it's a lot of like consumerism, right? All right, so Albert drops the bomb. I saw her. She wasn't shopping. She was having lunch with a young guy. They seemed pretty familiar to each other. Marcus, unperturbed, not bothered, right? Seemingly not bothered by this. Albert goes on. I know, I know her background. It's always worried me that you picked her. Okay. So we get several years after Marcus's wife has died, right? And then all of a sudden he meets this girl who sells flowers in the Bronx. Now, the Bronx, and again, this story is set in New York City, apparently. The Bronx is always kind of the lower class, right? When we think of the Bronx, this is like a county. It's one of the boroughs of New York City. It's kind of like you look down on it, right? It's kind of considered to be the lower class. And here's a working class girl. She lives in the Bronx in a working class neighborhood. She sells flowers at a corner market. So she's not rich. She doesn't own the shop, right? She's not wealthy. She's not independently set up. And Albert's really concerned, like, hey, dude, you just kind of picked this low class woman, right? You're up here. She's down here. And then he says, maybe she's preparing for someone newer than you, kind of setting herself up, right? Marcus doesn't seem to be fazed too much, but he asks this question here. You know nothing about this guy she was with? Albert reads, oh, yes, I do. I followed him. Now, since we know how the story ends, this question kind of is really loaded. Like, there's a lot of irony in this question here, right? Because Marcus knows something that Albert doesn't. To Albert, he's like, hey, do you know anything else about her? Like Albert thinks like, hey, he wants me to, he wants to know if I know anything. And of course I do, right? Like I'm pleasing my master, right? I'm pleasing my boss. So Marcus, though, asks this question. We're kind of like, okay, is he kind of protecting himself? Is he kind of like, is there something I don't want out there, right? Albert reveals that he followed him. His name is Peter. Marcus, I see. It's good to know you're looking out for me. I'll take it from here. Albert leaves. Marcus settles in. Jolene comes back. She's got all these bags. She's got all this stuff. And it says she came into the room with bags and energy. And she's just this bubbly, lively girl, right? And she just kind of brightens up the room. Okay. Comes in, sits down, gets a drink. She's talking to Marcus. And then he just says this question here. Now, Jolene, tell me about Peter. And I put it over here, Marcus confronts Jolene, right? Like if you stopped right here, you're like, gigs up, right? He knows. And notice, and you might think like, oh, he's being sneaky, right? Like he's just being calm, casual. He's not yelling, screaming. He's like, so tell me about Peter. She contemplated, and then this is her answer. Peter's fine. He sends his love and as always thanks you for the support you've given him over the years. Now, if you stopped here, what would you think? Right. And so there's any number of different possibilities, but it's clear that Marcus has been providing financial support for Peter for some time. And that Jolene seems to be the go-to between them, right? The go-between there, that whenever Peter wants to talk to Marcus or wants to share something with Marcus, he goes through Jolene. She continues though. But darling, you have to understand he's not complete. He so much wants to meet you. And again, if you stopped here, you got to have this question like, what's going on? What's going on? Who is this guy? What is his connection? And then she says he needs to know his father. And so again, notice all these different little events. They pile up and they pile up and you're thinking, oh, it's going this way. Nope. Now it's going this way. Nope. Now it's going here. And each of these little pieces just kind of adds on to the irony a little bit, right? It's so important for him. Don't you think it's time you acknowledged him as your son? Oh, Now it's not just somebody Jolene knows, but it's his son. And again, all these little bits of irony, they just kind of keep piling up, right? And they keep changing the way we see things. I think that when you got done with Albert, right when Albert left, you're like, oh my God, Jolene, you're horrible, you're awful, you're a gold digger, and you're just using Marcus, and you got this thing on the side going on, right? Like you don't like Jolene, and you kind of feel sorry for Marcus, right? Like you're like, oh God, Marcus, I'm so sorry for you. You're getting used like this, or you're not smart enough to see that you're getting used. Maybe you just kind of not only just feel sorry for him, maybe you feel pity for him. Like, dude, you just don't see this is going on, right? Or that you set yourself up. Maybe like, this is kind of what you deserve, right? Now, Albert, I don't know what you might think of Albert up to this point. Maybe like, oh, you're doing the, you're a faithful friend. You're a great guy. I really want that person in my life. Like maybe you're the person that is really there for his friends, right? And maybe you're like sneaky dog, right? Like I don't know, man. You're always you got your nose in other people's business. Do you really need to be doing all that, right? Once we get Jolene revealing that Peter is Marcus's son, those dynamics shift a lot, right? Like our feelings and our emotions really probably change at that point. And then she says this, and I think this is the key here, and this really reveals everything in the story. Surely by now she could forgive you. She's looking at the picture of Marcus's wife. And now all the pieces fit together. Peter is Marcus and Jolene's son. At this point, we really realize that Marcus had an affair with Jolene, and Peter is their son. But because Marcus was married and had and wanted to keep this perfect life or whatever, supported but didn't acknowledge the son, right? And then after, apparently there's probably what happened was, Marcus broke it off, or maybe it was a one night stand or something like that. But then after his wife dies and he's just doing his thing, going through his life, he runs into her by accident, probably. And kind of like Albert says, one day you meet this woman and then you have this relationship and boom, here we are. Can you imagine? Probably Marcus is just going through his life. He's sad, he's upset, he's lost. And all of a sudden he sees this woman that he's had a relationship with, and and we know that he had this son with, right? This thing that has this life. And I think maybe if you draw all those pieces together, this is where Marcus starts to realize that there's more to life than just the money and the business. Albert can't see that. Marcus does get to see that. In fact, actually, this is kind of like that last line that he says. It's the relationship that matters. The relationship is all that matters. And again, we notice here now relationships between all the different people in this story. Okay. So again, these are the two stories for the final. I'm sorry, the two. This is the two nonfiction pieces, and then the fictional piece that we have for the final. You do have access to the annotations, all my notations and stuff there on the side, plus this video. I do hope this helps you. I hope that you get a little bit more out of it, a little more deeper. Again, we will go over it in class, but I wanted to give you another piece of information that you could use to access. Good luck on your finals.